My father wasn't prepared and didn't have a game plan for raising children. My dad was easily angered. He was a military man, disciplined with the belt, with his fists occasionally. He would chase us around the house till he cornered us, but he always disciplined in anger, and he was quickly angered. And the result was that he raised angry children. His siblings told me that his father was an angry man, and this is what I was told. I don't know if it's true, but that they would, his father would take him out in the backyard, tie him to a post, and spank him, whip him. I had vowed early that what was happening to me at home would not happen to me outside. But it wasn't as though I consciously made that choice. Life was just happening to me. I remember running away at 8 years old, so that's an indication to me that how early I thought my problem was at home. I mean, an 8-year-old isn't really thinking these things through. I came home at supper time because I was hungry, and they had never knew that I was gone. One of the very few memories I have in my childhood was when I was a boy of about 8 years old, went out on a sand lot, and there was an older kid, about 17 or 18. We were playing baseball, and my father had given me a glove. I don't know where he got it, but it was like a frying pan. It was straight up and down. The fingers did not connect, they were just all straight up. The only way I could hit anything was to bat it and hope it would land in my hand. And that's what happened one day. I was playing shortstop, and a guy hit a ball right to me. I just held my hand up for self-defense, and the ball just bounced straight up, and I caught it. And that teenager who was doing the pitching said, "Great catch, kid." I remember that story at the age of 74. A kid I never saw again, never met before that day. I can tell you on this day, whoever that young man was, gave me something I wasn't getting at home. Nice catch, kid, from a stranger. We were raised in the Roman Catholic faith, and both my parents would be in church on Sunday, but there was no reality at home. As long as you were in good standing with the church, you were in good standing with God, because there was zero reality at home. There was bad language, there was anger, there was discipline and anger, but I would have said that I was Catholic. And as a young boy, I would go to Mass sometimes in the mornings before even the nuns would get there. I'd be the only one in church with the nuns. And I would stare at the tabernacle in the darkness, and I would come up and kneel at the railing sometimes, and I would want God to come out of that box so that I could see him. And that was sincere. But by the time I hit 12 years old, that had all faded. I felt that the answer to my problems would be to get away from my dad. But I was developing an anger problem. As a result, if anybody looked at me in a negative way, especially those in authority, there would be an immediate reaction, resentment, anger towards that person. As far as my peers went, I was good time Charlie until someone criticized me in some way or looked with disapproval on me, and then the anger would take over. I was regularly in fistfights, just by rage. I was getting my strokes from my friends. I was led to believe that I was intelligent. I could do the work. I just didn't want to do the work. Getting the approval of my peers was more important. For example, when we were living on the south side of Chicago for a few years, another 4-year stint because my father was in the military, we actually had a gang of 40 guys. I was the vice president. And so it just gives you an indication looking back where I was in the hierarchy in terms of acceptance and peer acceptance. But none of us would have thought ourselves as evil or bad, but we knew that we're walking on the wild side. I did run away from home twice, once when I was 8 and once when I was 17. Both times minors, but 17 now. I got away for a few days, ran away with a friend who also had a tough home life. And we hitchhiked, we were living in Chicago at the time, and we had made it as far as Indiana, Elkhart, Indiana, and we got picked up for vagrancy, and we spent the weekend in jail. A year later, I was 18. I had tried one semester at a community college and failed everything except physical education. So after one failed semester, and I knew I had to give the report card to my father, and it was just a row of descending Fs, except for physical education. And as I handed it to him, I can remember saying, "But Dad, more schooling isn't for me. I'm going to join the service." And you can see there, even under all the bad relationship, all the anger, there was still something in me that wanted to please my father. I wanted to get my father's approval. How best to appease a military man and get out of the house at the same time was to join the service. I decided to join the Navy because my father was in the Air Force, and I figured that that would be the greatest distance I can put between us. I wound up on aircraft carriers, so, for an angry young man who has a problem with authority to join the military, that was one of the worst decisions I ever made in my life. My experience in the Navy, it was a little over 3 years. I was court-martialed 7 times in 3.5 years. I went to the brig 6 times, 5 times for going AWOL and once for assaulting an officer with a frying pan. You could tell where I was working at the time. I didn't hit him with it, I just chased him around the mess hall with it. But it's still assault, and they take a dim view of that. In the end, though, I finally wound up doing a 6-month sentence up at the naval prison in Portsmouth. I always felt like if I could get out of the Navy, just like I felt if I could leave home, then my problems would be over. I'm not proud to say it today, that's just my story. I was thrown out of the Navy with a bad conduct discharge. I wish it could have been different, but it wasn't. After I left the Navy, I thought, well, now my folks were living somewhere else. I was no more living with my family when I had left. They were still living in Chicago when I joined the service. And so 3.5 years later, I was living in Manchester, New Hampshire. Ironically, because that's where I was born. And I always felt like if any place was home, it was where I was born. And so I went back to Manchester, New Hampshire. I had one job after another. I was a common laborer, but I had so many jobs that I could usually do with any company. There was a lot of manufacturing in that city. A lot of shoe shops. I work in a lot of shoe shops. A lot of warehouses, forklift driver, receiving, shipping, that kind of thing. I had 35 jobs by the time I was 30 years old. 35 jobs by the time I was 30 years old. That's a lot of jobs. And there was a lot of pain behind that. It was, it sounds funny now, but it's like I left in a rage. I was only fired twice. Once for coming in drunk, and the other time for beating up a fellow employee. The other times, I just quit. Sometimes because I just didn't like it, but most of the time because I got angry at my boss or whoever was over me. It was my opinion that it was just my luck that I would wind up working for 35 jerks in a row. Obviously they were the problem, not me, So there's this constant restlessness. There's always this need to, obviously to find another job, but then finally when I would get to the point where I was in between jobs, I would break into businesses at night. I prided myself into thinking I was some modern day Robin Hood, rob from the rich and give to the poor, meaning me. So I would justify my taking from businesses. I would never rob an individual. And primarily the robbery of the drive-in theater. Me and a friend did that. We had actually arranged a situation with a guy who worked there. We robbed a ticket taker, but got caught for it 3 days later. And originally the charges were armed robbery, but because they couldn't produce the weapons, it was reduced to assault and robbery. So I got a 1 to 5 year sentence. I served 13 months in there. I thought getting out of my father's house was the answer. It wasn't. I thought getting out of the Navy was the answer. It wasn't. I thought leaving this job after job after job, whatever job I was in, if I wasn't happy, I'd find another one. So it was always I had to change my location, my job, my situation, because happiness would be right around the corner. There's a verse in Isaiah 57, 20 and 21, that says, "The wicked are like the tossing sea, which cannot rest, whose waves toss up muck and mire. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked." That was me to a T. No peace, restless, tossing up muck and mire. And my self-appraisal was not muck and mire, it was just everybody else's problem, I was never the problem. Going to prison was an eye-opener in a couple ways. It's one thing to be thrown in a city lockup or a county jail, and you all wind up in a county jail at first until you're sentenced. But going to the state prison, you just realize you've stepped into something a whole lot bigger than you had ever anticipated. But one of my first impressions was where are all the bad guys? It sounds odd to say because there are people who have done bad things there. But as I looked around the prison yard, they were all people just like me. Not saying that there weren't dangerous people there. And I can't say that I didn't have a couple enemies that were extremely dangerous. And only by the grace of God did I survive it. Even though I didn't know them, I see that God was protecting me. But most inmates are not how people on the outside stereotype them. Prison is all about routine. It's the same every day. Wake up, get a meal at a certain time, shower, go to your work, whatever it is, your couple hours of free time at night, back to your cell, et cetera, et cetera. But routine is safety. Prison experience is all about staying under the radar. The guy that's always causing trouble is going to have a rough road to hoe. The guy that boasts too much among his fellow inmates is going to have trouble. You know, I'm sure it was a disappointment. I had already been a disappointment, though, for many years. State prison probably was a culmination. I know my mom was very upset to say to people. She wouldn't usually tell them. When I went to the state prison, though, they were living down south at the time. My father was in the military again still, but my father had a heart attack that coincided with the news of hearing that his son was in prison. And some relatives in Manchester told me, because I was in the county jail in Manchester at the time, and they brought the news that my father was in the hospital with a heart attack, his first one. And so I'm struck with, I gave my father a heart attack. And I started bawling like a baby right there at the gate. All the tiers, there were 4 tiers, and they told me down at the bottom tier, so I didn't care who was watching. I felt that I didn't even know if he was going to live or die, so I was dealing with that. And I have a great sensitivity today to men who find out that a loved one died while they were in prison. A lot of shame and guilt behind that. In my case, I actually felt that I provoked it. But he survived it, and God gave him another 15 years after that. The Salvation Army came in one Christmas Eve. I don't remember them giving a message of salvation. They may have, it just may not have been my time. But we all went, in fact, at that time, they had us all come out of our cells to listen to their songs. They sang Christmas songs to us. And they gave us a little folder, a cupcake holder of hard candy. And we all walked back to our cells, and we were taking the hard candy and throwing them against the wall and watching them shatter, because we got to be cool. But probably every one of us, when we got back to our cells, counted how many are left, because that's the price of being cool. But I was laying on my bunk that night. It was a Christmas Eve, and I wondered to myself, what kind of people give up their Christmas Eve to come in and sing to a bunch of inmates and leave their families on Christmas Eve? Once I was released, every time I passed a red Salvation Army bucket, even though I didn't have 2 cents to rub together, I would take what I had, the coins, and put them in the bucket, because it was my way of saying thanks to something I didn't even understand. I just appreciated what they had done. I was a salesman for a brief amount of time. It was going to be a short-lived job, as most of my jobs were. I liked to talk to people, but I didn't have the heart to sell them anything. I can remember knocking on a pastor's door, a little Baptist church. He shared Christ with me immediately. I'm talking about cleaning chemicals, and he'd say things like, well, you know, Jesus can clean your life up. It always got around to Jesus, and I knew that Jesus was one of the main players on the stage from my Catholic upbringing. I had no problem believing that he was God, but he was part of the scenery. He wasn't the key, but he kept talking about Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And I would leave there. I saw them only once a month, and I'd come back the following month. Sure enough, same thing. Conversation turned around to Jesus. And finally, in the spring of 1975, he got a phone call one time. We would talk on the porch. And his wife, they were like a tag team. His wife came out to talk to me. And he went and answered the phone. And she took up right up where he left off and starts talking about Jesus. And then she asked me, where do you think you would go if you died tonight? And I was, good time, Charlie. I said, I'll go to heaven. And she says, why do you think that? He says, because God knows I'm basically a nice guy. All the muck and mire of my life. And that was still my self-appraisal. Good time, Charlie. God knows I'm basically a nice guy. She looked right at me and she said, well, I'm afraid to tell you this, Lennie, but God is going to say, depart from me, you worker of iniquity, because I never knew you. Good time Charlie needed a spear thrown right at his heart. I'm a worker of iniquity. I knew that was bad. Wasn't sure what it meant, but I knew it was bad. That I was a sinner. And that's what I needed to hear. I didn't need anger management. I didn't need AA for my drinking. Those are all wonderful programs. I needed to know I was in a whole heap of trouble. And that's when I got in my car. And I remember before I started it up, I looked up at the sky and I said, Father. It's so odd that I called him Father, but I think maybe that was what Catholics do. That's what I did. Father, I says, I now have the facts about what you did, but I don't have the faith to believe it. I even said, you're going to have to show me something. And what he did was a series of little things after that. I noticed that right after leaving them, my next stop would be a big sale. And I was a terrible salesman. And I began to connect that. Then they had us over, my wife and I. My wife was an atheist at the time. She did not believe in God. People say there are no real atheists. That's not true. She used to say that asking her to believe in God was like asking her to believe in Santa Claus. It's just not real. But they invited us over to their house and we met their kids. And we left there thinking, I don't know what they have, but they have something we don't have. Their home was peaceful. The kids were obedient. The family was just mellow. You know, they were just sweet. At that time, the pastor said the statement that threw the second spear. He said, do you believe that God is loving? I said, yeah, God is loving. He says, then why don't you think he would do something so loving as to send his son to die on a cross for your sins, if that's all he could do to make you right with himself? And the logic of that just penetrated. Yes, that is what God would do if that's what he had to do. And so first the law, meaning that I had to know I had broken the commandments, I was a sinner, and I acknowledged that, I could feel it through and through, but that he had remedied it, that he had sent his son to die on a cross for my sins, for what I had done. It just seemed too incredible to me, but I wish I could tell you the day. I don't remember the exact day. I just remember it was sometime in the spring of 1975, I went from death to life. Some things changed immediately. One was that my mouth got cleaned up. I was one of the most foul-speaking individuals. I thought everyone spoke in four-letter words. He did that miraculously. The anger took a while, and I think what God allowed was I needed to see that he was able to do the miraculous, cleaned up my language, but I struggled with my anger for some time after that. He gave me an immediate love for his word. That was a gift from God. I think all Christians have an affinity and a love for his word, but for me it was immediate. I couldn't get enough of that book. He had put Christian neighbors next door to us. They weren't the ones that led us to the Lord, but the husband began to meet with me. The pastor, we wound up going to the church. My wife was saved 2 months after me. They told me they were praying for her, and I was so young in the Lord, I said, well, it's going to take more than prayer. You don't know my wife. But 2 months later, he gave an invitation, and he's probably given only 2 in his life because he just builds relationships with people. But he kept asking again, if anybody here this morning would like to give their life to Christ, raise your hand. He came back around 2 or 3 times, and finally she went, and her life was changed. And God restored our marriage. We were on the brink of divorce, and we didn't care. There was no love left in the marriage. And today I can't imagine life without her. You know, and it was that same pastor who directed me towards prison ministry. I was all done with prison. But there was a local ministry going on at the county jail, which was only 2 miles away from the church. And someone said, you know, there's an opportunity for people to go in and observe a service. So he says, why don't you go? You don't know if God might use that. And because he was my pastor and God had given me that was another thing he did, give me a submission to authority that had never been there before. So because he recommended, I went because he said so. And that first visit into prison, I sat in the audience and they did a church service for the inmates. So you're sitting with the inmates. But I didn't see the inmates really. All I felt was how it felt to be back there. And it rang all the old emotional bells for me. I heard the yelling on the tears. I heard the clanging of the doors. I heard the intercom that the officers were using that never quite works right. The shouting, the sanitary, clinical environment. And I left there thinking, thank you, Lord, you're not calling me into anything like this. Been there, done that. But on the way out, there was this chaplain who was the kind of person you wouldn't expect would relate to inmates. You know, he's very mild, meek-mannered, thick glasses, kind of academic, but he loved the inmates. And he knew I was a hippie, had been a hippie, still strummed C, D, and G, and still working on F. And he said, you know, I need someone to play music for me on a Sunday night. He said, could you at least play the guitar for me? And I immediately said yes without thinking, but it never dawned on me till after I left it. That means you're going back. I went back the following Sunday, and all the emotional bells had disappeared. I was able to look into their eyes and see them, and I've never looked back. I can even remember guys' names who were in that audience that first night. I not only started strumming the guitar, but because I met the inmates, I started praying, Lord, if I can have a chance to do a Bible study with them, I'd be willing to do that. Well, that's all the Lord needs to hear, and he must have put the idea in my heart. Within a week, the chaplain allowed me to have a Bible study for the awaiting trial unit. That means these are guys that just got arrested. A lot of them are facing heavy charges and heavy time. At least 2 of the guys were there for murder. And these guys couldn't see each other all day. They're just in their cells, so they're yelling to each other all day long. Or they can come to this Bible study. And so they're all fooling around for the first 5 minutes, but within 5 minutes, God would put his hand on that meeting and they would be listening. And the Bible study was going so well, but I didn't have a chance to follow up the salvation message with anybody. I would preach that Jesus died on the cross for your sins, that he's the Almighty God who loves you so much, but I would never get the follow-up. So my prayer then was, Lord, if I could get up on the tiers where they live, I'd be willing to do that. Within 2 weeks, God had me going cell to cell. I was working 4 10-hour days, but on my one day off, a Thursday, I would go into the jail and go cell to cell. And I can remember coming to Boo Boo's cell. That's his nickname. He wound up serving time for murder. I would see him in the state prison later on, visit him up there. He was the one through whom God gave me a special calling. He was one of the first men to pray to receive Christ with me. He was 18 years old at the time, soon to be sentenced for murder. He didn't commit the murder. It was a robbery where the other guy pulled the trigger, but you're both going to prison for it. And he prayed to receive Christ. And as tears are coming down his face, I sensed, whatever word you want to use, that Jesus Christ was standing behind me. He was so strong, he was behind me to my right. That's where he was standing. And I sensed, whatever you want to call it, he put his right hand on my right shoulder, and he said to me, I don't think it was audible, I just heard it loud and clear, this is what I want you doing. And because that was such a strong calling, I would not veer from that calling unless I had such a strong calling out of it. That's why I'm still doing it to this day. Next week will be 42 years. I was assigned to prisons in California, federal prisons, state prisons, and we were volunteers in a sense. They called us para-chaplains. We came alongside the chaplains and did chaplaincy work with them. Then they sent us to Florida, where I became a para-chaplain with the chaplain of Florida State Prison. That's where the death row is, and back on the units where guys are doing 300 or 400 year sentences. When I had the opportunity to go back to New England, a man was leaving the Evangelistic Association of New England. I came on with them in 1982 after 3 years with Campus Crusade and was with them for the next 22 years. Our personal goal was that every institution in New England would have the gospel going in at least once a week by Bible-believing, Jesus-loving, gospel-preaching, fire-breathing, nostril-flaring Christians. You know, that's what we wanted in there. My job was to make contact with the local jails or prisons, ask them what do they have going on in terms of Christian services, and then, if they don't have anything, reach out to the local churches in the community of the prison. Our firm belief, and still is today, that any ministry has to go under the auspices of the local church. 4 years later, that goal was reached. I'm thinking we're heading for like 20 years of, laboring to get that goal reached. The goal of every prison in New England, we're talking 150 institutions, was reached within 4 years by Bible-believing, Jesus-loving, gospel-preaching Christians. Then the job was just maintenance. I felt like I had a Paul kind of ministry in that I would go back around to all these prisons where we had gotten people started and encourage them, see how the work was doing. And so many of these dear volunteers, they labor by themselves. 1 or 2 going in every single week. But every year we had a conference, a prison ministry conference for volunteers, just to give them a shot in the arm. And they want you to see what God is doing in their prison. One of the things about prison ministry is that people get into it and realize that God can use them in that setting. And there's this aura about the name prison ministry because of the stereotypes about prison. So people think it's a big, scary place. But they get in there and they realize God can use them. And these dear-hearted people who God has broken, I mean, think of their spiritual condition. They've been humiliated, they're broken, they're hurting, they're lonely, and they have no problem admitting that they've messed up. What a fertile ground for the gospel. Even the term jailhouse religion, even though it's often used in a scoffing kind of way, is based on reality. The whole term exists because there's something going on in jails that is unusual compared to what's going on in the streets. The average person has not been to prison, so they can't imagine it. And we used to be able to just take people with us. Now they've got to go through the clearance. If you want to be a volunteer, you've got to go through their orientation period. You've got to go through all these hoops. And so the advantage we used to have of just bringing Charlie along with us so that he could see whether they're called to this or not is gone. Now they've got to make a commitment by faith. They're going to sign up. They're going to go to the orientation. It's a bigger commitment. What we really need most of all, though, is that the church be educated that if Christ has done a work in these lives, they've got to surrender the stereotypes. I had a friend who was up in Maine, one of the workers that was working up in Maine, and we had left the evening service at the jail in Lewiston. We had given a gospel message to the men that came out, and as we're driving away, he said, I feel like we're giving birth to babies and then throwing them out on the front lawn to die. And I never forgot that he said that. And it's true, there's a lot of evangelism, and it's a fertile ground for evangelism. And they've heard so much about the church. And then they come out and they find the doors not as open to them as they were expecting. And the church is afraid. They're afraid that there's a Saul out there who was breathing fire and threatening the church before. And Barnabas realizes that he's been saved. That's what we need. We need people who are somewhere in between both worlds, who know that Saul has been changed. But you can't blame the church for being afraid of Saul. He was putting them to death before that. So they got a right to be afraid. And so people are thinking of these crimes, and you want to bring that person there? He's going to be talking to my daughter. They know theologically a person's been saved, but when it comes to brass tacks, all they can think of is their crime. A man who's going to play the church, try to con the church, can't keep it up for long. He's going to get impatient. The flesh cannot manufacture spirituality for very long. They can be humble, they can look like a Christian, talk like a Christian, but they're not going to play the game for long, if it's a game. Doesn't mean the man or woman will be perfect, but you will notice a steady faithfulness, a walking in the same direction towards Christ. And if they do that, let the church decide how much time you need to give them, monitor how much interaction they can have, but give them a chance. Let them see that this is Paul who's going to turn that world upside down. When I see people making it hard for prisoners to access the church, you know what I think? Just shutting the door on a gift that God was giving you. God recognized that you need what this person has, and that person needs what you have. They need fellowship. I knew a church that only allowed a Sunday morning experience, and you couldn't have more than that. They need more than that. Sunday morning is a collection of sinners worshiping their Savior, but they need to be in fellowship. I know men personally, alive today, whom I knew in prison as prisoners, who are pastors of churches with a heart for the lost. One friend started a church up in Massachusetts. They're meeting in a high school. They went from like a few people from a Bible study to something like 800 people, and a conversion growth. And you know what their signs are? Their signs are, this is such and such a church, no perfect people allowed. And they're attracting people who know they're not perfect. I know another man, a Hispanic guy, who I gave a gift of, because he got so on fire for the Lord while he was in prison that I broke down and bought him a $20 Bible, English and Spanish. And I gave it to, his name's Jose, and I said, Jose, use this to the glory of God, because I can't afford to give out these Bibles as much as I can the paperbacks. He said, Lennie, I'll use it. I came back a week later, and he was all excited, and his accent, he says, Lennie, 5 people came to Jesus last week. I'm using this Bible because he wanted me to be sure that that was a worthy investment. Today, he's the pastor of a Spanish church. I had one guy who used to blow smoke in my face when I came to his cell. About 3 years later, he was giving his testimony at a Thanksgiving banquet. And part of his testimony was, yeah, Lennie used to come to my door and I used to blow smoke in his face. But here I am. Jesus Christ saved my life, turned my life around. After about 16 years of prison ministry, I was going up into Canada. The Canadian ex-convicts were coming down into America, so we would trade convicts, and it just seemed to have more clout, you know, if you were from another country. I was going up again, and I got stopped at the border one time by a crusty border officer on the Canadian side who couldn't understand why I was going into Canada for nothing to go into prison to talk to inmates. So she doubted that I was on the level. She thought I was avoiding taxes or something like that. And she turned me around. That was an 8-hour trip from where I lived to get to Canada. So that wasn't painless. And as I'm leaving, she threw a challenge out at me, and she says, or you could get a pardon. And I'm long past my parole. I don't need a pardon to get out of jail. But I said, well, what's that for? So, well, if you have a pardon, it's as though the crime never occurred, so you don't have to declare that you're an ex-felon. Well, that interested me because, you know, paying $100, that's what she said, has to happen each time I wanted to cross the border as an ex-felon. I had to fill out a lot of paperwork and pay $100. I thought a pardon might be better. So I applied. I was turned down the first time, applied again, and the governor had changed in the state of New Hampshire. I actually brought the newspaper article of what happened there. And let me read it to you because it says it better than I can. This is from 1993. You might like the title at the bottom. I don't know if you can read it. Converted ex-con wins rare New Hampshire pardon. You know, the Bible says we'll be called before governors and kings. Don't worry about what to say at that time. Listen to what was said that Caesar recorded on the front page of a newspaper. Listen to this, because this is not Lennie accomplishing this. An ex-convict who has spent 16 years at that time preaching to prison inmates was granted a rare pardon yesterday by the Executive Council. Lennie Spitale of Pepperell, Mass., who served 13 months in prison for assault and robbery at the now-defunct Manchester Drive-In Theater. You can see that I was really a high-class inmate. Robbing drive-in theaters. He told Executive Council members and Governor Steve Merrill that his life was changed in 1975. Now they put this in quotations, by a personal encounter with Jesus Christ. The council's decision in its first pardon hearing since 1987 was unanimous. Spitale told the councilors his story before they went into a closed session to discuss the case with Merrill and to cast their votes. After serving 13 months of a 1 to 5 year prison sentence, he said he was released and paroled in 1966 and moved to California. Spitale said he drifted around for a while. Quote, I didn't change. I didn't have any conscience about lying, stealing, things like that, he said. In those days, he said, I was rebellious, hostile, and irresponsible. Then, he said, he became a Christian in 1975, and his attitudes and his life changed. 2 years later, he began visiting prisons as a volunteer. When I went up for the pardon, the governor's council kept asking me questions. Well, what accounts for the change in your life? And I'd say, well, because I had been a prisoner in their prison system. This was New Hampshire. And this is the governor and his council, because we were applying for a pardon. And they said, why should we give you a pardon? I said, well, Jesus Christ changed my life, and this would be helpful as we cross the border to Canada, because I have to keep going through a lot of hoops to get through Canada. And so they would say, well, what accounts for the change in your life? And I'd say, well, Jesus Christ changed my life. And you know how they nod their heads, and they come back around and say, so did you go to school afterwards, and that's what changed you? I says, no, Jesus Christ changed my life. And so, you know, they nod their heads, and they came back around and they said, so did you go to a program, or, you know, did you like get anger management or something like that? And I say, no. At that point, inside, I'm being respectful on the outside, but inside I'm feeling like, oh, read my lips. Jesus changed my life, you know. Former Corrections Commissioner Ronald Powell, a minister who left his state job in June to teach at a Christian college, suggested that Spitale be granted a pardon. The Attorney General defends the state, said, he takes no position on the pardon, but he did tell the counselors that his office's review of the Spitale case showed nothing inconsistent with Spitale's testimony yesterday. Spitale, for his part, urged the council members to vote their conscience. Quote, "I would appreciate seeing this pardon, but, and I say this with all the honesty in my heart, in 1975 I received a far greater pardon." That's what God arranges. I had not thought to say that, and I never expected the media to quote it verbatim. The governor and his council, let me tell you what they said when they came back. Merrill said he saw the impact of crime on the victims, and we do need to remember that. As governor, he said, "I never expected to grant a pardon. However," he told Spitale, "I'm not going to stand in the way because we see before us rehabilitation, and we can help you by making a continuing contribution to what you're doing." "Praise God for it," Spitale said later. "I am very grateful. I am very grateful. I'm grateful to the only one who can change anything. Change them in your life, and let our testimony be, to God be the glory. Great things he has done." My father visited me after we'd become a Christian. We were now going into full-time prison ministry. And they came out from the West Coast. They were living in California. Mom and Dad came out. And I remember sharing the gospel with my mom, and he was sitting just behind her, but the whole time he was nodding his head, and I could tell it was a genuine affirmation. And he wanted to go for a walk later. And we walked around the block. Didn't talk about anything that I can remember in particular. But towards the end of the walk, he put his arm on my shoulder. That was the most awkward thing I ever felt in my life, because he had never done that before. But I knew what he was trying to say. He was saying to me, "Son, I'm sorry." And I received that. And I really believe my father came to know the Lord in the last year of his life. He died shortly after. I even forgave him posthumously because I learned that you could do that. I was able to share clearly the gospel at my dad's funeral. It was at a Catholic church, and I remember the priest was looking at his watch. I was talking longer than he was expecting me to. And his only brother came up to me with tears in his eyes and said, "For the first time in my life, I understand." And I received a grace there, closure with my dad. I'll see my dad in heaven.
Thanks for watching. I hope you were blessed or encouraged by Lennie's amazing story of how God transformed him from an angry man to one of the kindest and happiest Christians I know. The Transform Project is a collection of true life stories of men and women with lives that have been transformed by Jesus Christ. Please consider liking or subscribing to help us share more stories like this. And if you want to learn how you can partner with us, please go to transformproject.com.